Hello, everyone. Good evening. For those out on the West Coast, I guess good afternoon. My name is Eric Story. I'm the Outreach Manager of the Laurier Centre for Military Strategic and Disarmament Studies in Waterloo, Ontario. I hope you'll realize that, I'm only going to be using the Laurier Military Centre going forward. This is the Laurier Centre. Its very long name is very long. So myself and the rest of the folks at the Laurier Military Centre, as well as our partners, the Canadian Battlefields Foundation, the Juno Beach Center Association, and the Gregg Center for the Study of War and Society, would like to welcome you all to the Maple Leaf Route webinar series. But before we begin, I would like to acknowledge the extensive history in which the land in which the Laurier Military Centre resides. Our office is located on the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, and Neutral peoples. In 1701, this land fell under the dish with one spoon treaty between the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples, a treaty that was part of the Great Peace of Montreal in the same year that marked the end of the Beaver Wars of the 17th century. It represented and continues to represent today an eternal agreement to not only share and protect resources, but also solve conflicts peacefully. 80 some years later, in 1784, the Haldimand Proclamation was signed between the Haudenosaunee and British Crown following the American Revolution, and the Haudenosaunee were given a tract of land that extended 6 miles on either side of the Grand River from just north of Orangeville today to its source at Lake Erie. Today, this treaty territory remains the homeland of Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee communities, as well as the home of many Indigenous peoples across Turtle Island, and acknowledging their presence in the past and present reminds everyone of the responsibilities we all hold as treaty people. Now, some of you may be wondering, attending with us for the first time, what exactly is the Maple Leaf Route webinar series, and what exactly are we going to be doing this summer? Well, why don't I just give you a really quick and general sense of what we're going to be doing. So every 2 weeks starting tonight all the way until early September, we will be following the Canadians through the battles of Normandy in 1944, from the D-Day beaches through the capture of Caen in July and the fighting towards Falaise in August. The cost was enormous. From the 6th of June to the 23rd of August 1944, over 5,000 Canadians lost their lives. And any visitor to the war cemeteries in Normandy cannot but be moved by such losses. Now, our 9-part series over the summer will feature a range of historians asking a range of historical questions. Some of these questions will be tactical, others will consider the little-known role of Canadian women on the battlefield, and others yet will explore the importance of morale and the puzzle of psychological stress. All our speakers will reflect in some way on the ever-changing ways we remember the Canadians in the battles of Normandy. Now, if after tonight's event and throughout the series, you feel you have learned something of value, we would ask you to please consider donating to the Canadian Battlefields Foundation and the Juno Beach Center Association. During these difficult pandemic times, your donations will keep future tours alive and ensure that the Canadian contributions to the Second World War will not be forgotten. And you can donate to both the Canadian Battlefields Foundation and the Juno Beach Center Association by visiting our website, the Laurier Military Center's website, canadianmilitaryhistory.ca/webinar, and clicking donate at the top of the page. That's canadianmilitaryhistory.ca/webinar. The Juno Beach Center and Association in particular is helping to preserve the memory of our veterans through a flag sponsorship program. Sponsor a flag today as a treasured reminder of Canadian courage. And now I'd like to turn it over to my co-host for this evening, Dr. Jeffrey Hayes of the University of Waterloo, a director of the Canadian Battlefields Foundation, who has co-led alongside Brigadier General David Patterson many tours over the last 20 years. He will introduce our first speaker for the Maple Leaf Route webinar series. Jeff, take it over.
Thanks, Eric. The Canadian Battlefields Foundation was the brainchild of a group of determined veterans and academics and political figures who were concerned in the early 1990s that the Canadian role in the battles of Normandy was being overlooked. the CBF, as it later became known, and the Juno Beach Center have worked together to ensure that the Canadian role in the campaign remains fresh in the minds of French, Europeans, as well as Canadians. Since the 6th of June, 2003, official ceremonies at the Juno Beach Center have brought together participants from many countries to reflect and remember. The center is also an important place for visitors to learn about Canada, both past and present. But on the day after the 6th of June, the foundation then organizes a series of commemorative ceremonies. The first one is held at the Canadian Memorial Garden on the grounds of Le Memorial in Caen. The second is at the Place de l'Ancienne Boucherie in the middle of the city, where Canadians first met French civilians after the capture of the city in July of 1944. And then the third ceremony is held in the Garden of the Abbé Ardin, where Canadian soldiers were murdered in June of 1944. The 12 students chosen for the Foundation's annual study tours actively participate in these ceremonies. Since 1996, the Foundation has brought together an array of remarkable young women and men from all parts of the country. They've included members of First Nations, the grandchildren of veterans, serving members of the Canadian Armed Forces, some of whom are veterans themselves now, as well as future teachers, academics, and decision makers. We will hear from some of them in the weeks to come. This is the second year then that the CBF has been unable to organize a student tour. As such, our foundation president, General Marc Lessard, agreed that a virtual tour, drawing on a distinguished panel of academics, would offer a chance for a wider audience to see the foundation's mandate in practice. So if you will, imagine yourself over the next, well, both tonight and over the next few months, to imagine yourself in the battlefields of Normandy on a tour with some of the best guides to inform and inspire you. Imagine our first speaker, as we will see in a few minutes, on the windswept sands of Juno Beach, a place that he has studied for over 40 years. Terry Copp has done more than any single academic to create an informed memory of the Canadian role in Normandy, and indeed throughout the Second World War. Many of you, of course, will know Terry's extensive work on the Canadian involvement in Canada's involvement in the war. His extensive library includes the latest edition of the Normandy Battlefield Guide, which so many people have used to try to explore these lands for themselves. The latest edition, with the help of Matt Baker, is available for purchase tonight. But Terry's going to lead us on a tour of Juno Beach. He's also going to reflect a little bit on his role in the foundation, particularly with its founding veterans, people like Hamilton Southam, General Roland Reed, and Charlie Belzile, who were all central in reviving knowledge of the Canadian role in Normandy. Terry, thanks for agreeing to speak with us tonight. Allow me again to be a student of yours, always have been, by asking a series of questions. I'll be the one in the van with my hand up, both about the Battle of Normandy and your thoughts on the shifting memory of these events. So Terry, could you begin by reviewing the operational challenges that confronted the Germans and the Allies on D-Day?
Thanks very much, Jeff, and welcome to all the viewers. I want you to try and imagine that you are coming on one of our battlefield tours. In our new battlefield guide, Matt Baker and I recommend a 10-day tour that begins after we reach Charles de Gaulle Airport in Paris and get on our vans, or if there are a lot of us, onto a 45-passenger bus. And we travel first to Ypres so that we can participate in a brief study of places like Vancouver Corner and the museum in the heart of Ypres, and of course, above all, the ceremony at 8 o'clock in the evening, which has been going on ever since 1919 with the slight interruption of the Second World War. The next day, we would travel on to Vimy, beginning at the ridge that allows us to overlook the entire core battlefield, and then going to visit the new museum that's there, or exhibition center, but above all, spending time at the memorial, Our next stop, because we want an overview of the Canadian experience in Europe, would be Beaumont-Hamel, where the Royal Newfoundland Regiment in July of 1960, was so deeply involved in an issue that resonates through the entire history of Newfoundland. But then it would be time for us, because we're on a 10-day tour, to travel to Dieppe. And we would want to very carefully consider the issues involved in Dieppe in what I call a decision-making exercise, so we could understand what it was that the planners and the executors of the strategy had to confer with and consider. But now we've moved to Normandy. We drove to Normandy, and yesterday we began a study of the battlefields where the Canadian 1st Parachute Battalion fought along with the rest of 6th British Airborne. We start there, of course, because they landed about 8 hours before Canadian troops stormed the actual beaches of Juno. And we would have visited an extraordinary museum dedicated to 6th British Airborne that includes some remarkable detail about 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion. But now it is the next morning, and we stayed in a really nice place called the Moulin Morin, which is a 13th century mill modernized and converted into self-catering accommodation so that we can barbecue a dinner, as well as going into nearby Bayeux, which is only a kilometer away, and enjoying real French cuisine on a regular basis. But this morning we got up early and we traveled either to Arromanches on the hill overlooking the Mulberry Harbor, or more likely these days to the Juno Beach Center, where we begin the process of studying what it is that we are here in Normandy to do. So I want to begin by trying to do, just as I would if we were at the actual Juno Beach Center, I want to try and talk about the defensive challenges that were facing the German defenders of Normandy in June of 1944, so that we can understand both their problems and, if possible, their solutions, although, as we know, the solutions did not work very well. So the first problem confronting the Germans is what we call the dilemma of perimeter defense. That is, as with France in 1940, as with the Soviet Union in 1941 during the 2 German invasions, the defenders had no idea of where the attack would be, or when it would begin, or where the main point of impact would be. So, for the Germans in 1944, attempting to defend more than 1,000 kilometers of Atlantic coast between the Scheldt estuary and presumably somewhere deep in the heart of southern France, they had to consider what the possibilities were. And as I'm sure you know, we had created a situation, that is, we being the Allies, had created a situation where over across the English Channel in Kent, General George Patton, who was without question the most feared Allied general, was seen to be in charge of a very large army, which in fact largely consisted of dummy tanks and dummy tents and radio broadcasts designed to simulate the existence of a large army. And all of this was part of a plan on the Allied side to convince the Germans that the landings would be not in Normandy, but in the Pas-de-Calais, the shortest route across the English Channel, a route so short that it's about 21 miles. And on a clear day, you can see the French coast from England or the English coast from France. So from the point of view of the Germans, and I describe this as the Pas-de-Calais fixation, they could not escape the view that under all circumstances, the Germans, the Allies, would attack at the Pas-de-Calais because it provided so many advantages: a short route to Germany, and of course, the ability to turn around the landing craft quickly, and other advantages, particularly with regard to air cover. So the Pas-de-Calais fixation was clearly in the minds of the Germans throughout their preparation to resist the invasion of Northwest Europe, which they knew was coming in 1944. And the Pas-de-Calais fixation was influenced perhaps by what is known as the double cross system, the system by which the British had captured and turned all German spies, brought into the United Kingdom, and was feeding intelligence, the wrong intelligence, to the Germans to reinforce their view that there was in fact a phantom army that was prepared to invade the Germans at the Pas-de-Calais, thus disguising the importance of Normandy. So to keep this simple, the Germans didn't know where we were coming and never seemed to be able to figure it out. Now, the second question that was most absorbing to the Germans was the question of the Atlantic Wall. And on the screen, you can see some of the improvised barriers that Rommel was responsible for having erected on the beaches, as well as poles in the fields of Normandy, which were designed to effect glider landings. The reality is that the Pas-de-Calais fixation had created a situation where the Germans had developed an elaborate summer program of construction of both concrete fortifications and various improvised fortifications. And the summer program of 1944 was complete by June the 6th to a limit of 70% in the Pas-de-Calais, meaning they built 70% of what they planned to build, but only 14% in Normandy, which had got not simply secondary status, but almost tertiary status in the German understanding of what it was that was going to happen. So the Atlantic Wall is in fact a bit of a myth in Normandy. It's been compared to a rope with a series of knots in it, each of the knots representing a concrete position, either a strong point or a resistance nest. But in between the knots on the rope for long stretches, the defenses are indeed very thin. And the Germans are aware of this, but then they are made, if you will, relaxed by the view that the invasion is not going to come in Normandy. And because I won't have time or inclination to go into this later, it is important to understand that the Germans continued to believe the Normandy invasion was a fake attack well after the landings in Normandy had been built up, so that the illusion that we had created was extraordinarily successful because it reinforced exactly what the Germans believed on the basis of their alleged superior strategic knowledge. So the other question that plagued the Germans in the pre-invasion period was how to deal with the invasion once it had landed, once they had actually arrived. And here, of course, many of you will know of the debate between Rommel, who believed that it was absolutely essential to defeat the invasion on the beaches, and therefore wanted to bring all of the best divisions forward as far as possible, and von Rundstedt, who believed that it was important to create an armored reserve which would be capable of dealing with the attack at the point at which it gathered strength. Now, we also presumably know, many of us, that the compromise that Hitler ordered or effected created a situation where part of the armored reserve was under Hitler's control, part under Rommel's, and part under von Rundstedt's. Many historians have regarded this as a serious problem for the Germans. I personally don't think it mattered very much on the day. Everyone seems to forget that if Rommel had had his way, many of the armored divisions that were used in Normandy relatively quickly would have ended up in the Pas-de-Calais, because he too was convinced that the logical place for the landing was north of the River Seine. So the last issue that the Germans worked very hard on trying to deal with before D-Day was they had accepted that the Allies had achieved air superiority over the battlefield, air superiority over France, indeed air superiority over Germany by 1944. So what were they to do about this? It meant that under normal circumstances, movement for German forces during the day, if the weather was okay, would be very limited. And therefore, such movements, certainly on large scale levels, would have to be made at night or in heavily overcast weather. But in addition, the Germans equipped their forces in Normandy and even more in the Pas-de-Calais with large capacity for anti-aircraft fire, believing correctly that the Allied aircraft, particularly the British aircraft, would be susceptible to well-organized anti-aircraft fire. Now, on the case of D-Day, this is perhaps less important, but as the battle continues, the presence of large numbers of 88mm flak guns in Normandy will be an important aspect of how the Germans hoped that under some circumstances, they would be able to prevent the Allied invasion from succeeding. We could add one other point that's a bit complicated, and I'll keep it as simple as I possibly can. The Germans knew, on the basis of Allied air superiority, that reinforcing Normandy was going to be difficult. The priority would have to be given to troops, to getting manpower there. So a considerable buildup of ordnance, shells, mortar, bombs, and other such material was effected in the months before D-Day. We know this because when the Americans overran Le Mans as part of Patton's sweep through Europe in the aftermath of late July, the storage of ammunition in Normandy that had not yet been used by the Germans was absolutely enormous. And Le Mans was only the largest of the dumps of materiel that had been accumulated to provide, particularly, as we know, mortar ammunition and Nebelwerfer ammunition for the Germans to use in the defense. So that was the best the Germans could do. How do we look at it from the Allied point of view? The Allies' problems and challenges can be summarized pretty quickly. First and foremost, they had achieved air superiority and, of course, control of the sea. But air superiority has to be maintained, as indeed does control of the sea. So the preparations for Operation Neptune, the assault phase of Overlord, were prepared with enormous naval resources, including, for example, Canadian frigates helping to block the passages into the invasion zone, and of course, destroyers and battleships and HMS Belfast and other cruisers, 6-inch gun and 8-inch gun cruisers, which could be used to support the landings. So the naval effort, which unfortunately much less attention is paid to than ought to be paid to, is an important, what I might call, full court press in the actual invasion period. Next, we had to know, particularly for Churchill and for the British chiefs of staff, how many divisions the Germans actually had in Normandy. And again, to keep this simple, through Ultra, the system of decrypting German intelligence signals, which were transmitted by an Enigma machine, as it's called, we were able to keep track of almost every German division in France, Belgium, and Holland. And we knew more or less where all of them were, except for 2 of them. Up until about 4 hours before June the 6th, we did not know exactly where 21 Panzer Division was. And we learned at that point that it was in the Caen area, moving closer to the coast. And a decision was made not to do anything about that. It didn't seem like a good idea to tell the troops who were carrying out the landing of where it was they were going to confront 21st Panzer Division. The other division that we couldn't find was 352nd, one of the best German divisions, which it turned out as early as March 1944 had begun to move into what we would come to call the areas of Omaha Beach and Gold Beach, and had brought forward a full regiment of troops with 2 regiments in relatively close support. So maybe it was lucky we didn't know that, because it might have discouraged people from being willing to undertake the attack in the way they did. If you look at Eisenhower's papers and his communications to General Marshall back in Washington, Eisenhower was particularly worried about mines. He felt the problem of getting the massive flotillas through the minefields the Germans had laid in the dark was a real challenge. It's very clear that right up until early June, Eisenhower kept a close watch on all of this, but then he was convinced that the mine-sweeping flotillas, including Royal Canadian Navy mine-sweeping flotillas, which actually took the troops into Omaha Beach, which is one of the remarkable little-known stories of the Normandy campaign, that Eisenhower was satisfied that the mine problem was dealt with. The second issue was beach obstacles. Rommel was determined to build as many obstacles on the beaches, particularly obstacles that could have mines attached to them, in the hope that it would blow up the bottoms of the landing craft as the assault occurred. Now, the difficulty with all of this is, again, the low priority allocated to Normandy, because it became clear by late May, early June, that the Germans had decided we would only land at high tide. And therefore, with the limited effort that they were able to make in Normandy, they placed the beach obstacles practically at the high tide line, assuming that we would come in and be mined against them. Whereas, of course, the Allies had long since decided that they were going to land about 3 hours before high tide, at what we'll call low to medium tide, and risk the danger of the infantry having to cross the beaches on the run under machine gun and mortar fire. That was considered the best solution, and Eisenhower was, like everyone else, was happy with the decision because he could tell from the air photographs, which were taken on a daily basis, that the beach obstacles were not stretching down to the area where the actual landing would occur. So we now are stuck with two other problems, and both of them are capable of solution. All along the Normandy coast, although at considerable distances, none of them behind Juno Beach, are coastal guns, which have the capacity to fire out to sea. It's important, of course, to stop those guns from having an effective ability to interfere with the Allied fleet. So we're going to bomb them on the night before D-Day. RAF Bomber Command, which is the experts at night bombing, will try and strike at places like the Merville Battery on the north side of Sword Beach, and at the Verville Battery on the south side of Juno Beach. And if things go really well, under some perfect circumstances, the bombs will actually come pretty close to the target and do some significant damage to the coastal batteries. But we need a backup plan. So the backup plan is the cruisers and battleships, which are going to engage the coastal batteries throughout the assault phase of D-Day and hopefully both draw their fire, but also bring about a situation where they will, with luck, be able to destroy the German coastal batteries. This leaves the problem of the beach defenses. I need you to understand, before we go looking at Juno Beach, the difference between coastal gun batteries, which are inland, capable of firing out to sea, and beach defenses, which are pillboxes, bunkers of the kind you see at the Juno Beach Center, and mortar positions covered by concrete all along the coast, which the Germans will use with considerable effect on D-Day. So the beach defenses, what do we do? Elaborate planning goes into the question of crushing the beach defenses. The most important single activity is supposed to be that the United States Army Air Force B-17s and B-24s will bomb in daylight conditions in the hour before the assault troops actually hit the beaches, and they will target the beach defenses. Now, I'll tell you now so we don't have to go back to it later. The weather conditions created such uncertainty for the United States Army Air Force that they ordered all of the bombers to take a 30-second to 1-minute delay after they sighted the coast, if they did sight the coast, because there was from 8/10 to 10/10 cloud cover, and the system of downward-looking radar that the Americans used, H2X, was simply not accurate enough to guarantee that the bombs would not fall back on the invasion fleet. So as I've frequently said, a lot of cows got killed in Normandy that morning. A lot of fields got dug up by the American bombs, but the beach defenses were totally untouched. Well, people who knew something about air power wouldn't have been too surprised by that if the weather was bad. So the next thing that we had done is planned a whole series of ways of suppressing the German defenses with, for example, rockets that were to be fired on the beaches to destroy the mines. We tied down the 105mm guns of the Allied armored regiments that were coming ashore, bolted them as much as we could to the decks of the heaving landing craft, and tried to use them to saturate the defenses with the fire from the guns, the 105mm guns. And of course, there were destroyers, which were also, with their 4-inch guns, able to add to suppressive fire. Again, to put material under control so that I have time later in this talk, it's perfectly clear that the weather created a situation whereby the suppressing fire did not work. It did not work because the heaving nature of a 4-foot chop in the Atlantic Channel created a situation where, though the gunners tried very hard to fire on the upward swing of the swell of the water, they still were not able to do it accurately. And operational research teams reported that the firing that took place on the beach defenses in Normandy from the sea was usually plus 200 yards and offline, so that it's possible to say from the beginning that there was no effective damage done to the beach defenses and no effective suppression of fire of the beach defenses during the course of the run-up to D-Day. So I want to make it clear that a lot of attention was paid to the problem of suppressing the beach defenses, and it was no one's fault except the weather that the circumstances of the invasion meant that there was no real damage to the beach defenses. We might also want to note that the Allies had worked very hard between Dieppe in 1942 and D-Day to create specialized armor, sometimes called Hobart's Funnies, the Armored Vehicles Royal Engineer, AVREs, which included, most interestingly for our purposes, the duplex drive or swimming tanks, Sherman tanks, which were surrounded by a canvas form that allowed them to swim ashore with a little propeller that was attached to the back of the tank. The idea, of course, was to get the armor right out in front of the infantry. And in addition, there were to be Royal Marines Centaurs, 105 millimeter guns, and other special equipment, including flails for mine clearance and petards for breaking concrete. All of this had been carefully worked on and very carefully prepared. And we'll maybe leave the question of how effective the DD tanks and the specialized armor were for our tour of each of the beaches, because it varies so much across the scene. About 2 years ago, my last lecture on D-Day, which I gave in person to maybe 150 people in an auditorium in Kitchener, was about the fact that the postponement of D-Day from May to June created this weather situation. If the original date, May the 5th, had been undertaken, the weather was perfect, and the likelihood is that the bombing and indeed the suppressive fire would have been successful. But waiting a month put us into a quite delicate weather situation, which affects every part of what we're doing. Since Montgomery's up on the screen, I'll make a last comment. Montgomery is an interesting leader in the period before the invasion. He takes his opinion is that what a leader must do is meet the troops and exude optimism. Where Eisenhower and his staff are worrying about the details and trying to correct them, Montgomery is fundamentally detached from the battle. It isn't his job, he feels, as Supreme Commander of 21 Army Group, and for purposes of the invasion, the American forces as well, to get involved in the detail. That's up to the specialists. His job is morale and to boost morale. We can have different views about that. I personally sometimes think Montgomery knew so little about the details of the invasion that it's surprising he was able to maintain his optimism, but he did. And here he is speaking to the Canadians and encouraging them to go and teach the Hun and crack about in the aftermath of the landing. Well, let's leave that. And we're now moving from the Juno Beach Center, where we've begun, out onto the beach itself in front of the Juno Beach Center. And we're going to talk about each of the beaches. So we're now trying to understand how all of this we've been talking about so far affected the Canadians at Juno Beach, as distinct from Gold or Omaha or Utah or indeed Sword Beach. So we're going to first of all look east toward, look west towards Gold Beach. And we're going to see a flat expanse of sand, and that is where the Canadian Scottish Regiment, or at least C Company of the Canadian Scottish Regiment, which was asked to protect the flank of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, who were landing at the main assault area. We're asking the Canadian Scottish to take out a gun, which actually didn't exist, but we didn't know that, and to capture the Chateau Vaux and protect the flank of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles. And it's a featureless terrain. In fact, the outstanding definition that you would encounter is there's a camping site called Camping Canadian Scottish, which allows you to identify actually the beach where they landed. Well, then if we move down the coast, we are into the area defended by the German 716th Division. Now, the 716th is a static division, no mobility whatsoever to move around from place to place. It has roughly 7,700 men, including two small East battalions made up of Russian prisoners of war who, facing the choice between death or the concentration camp or joining the German army, chose to join the German army. These East or Ost battalions are not likely to fight effectively, the Germans believe, but they're part of the order of battle of 716 Division. So in addition to the East battalions, 716 has 6 overall infantry battalions, but it has been tasked to defend Sword Beach, Juno Beach, and a large part of Gold Beach. Indeed, if it wasn't for 352nd Division coming forward in March and taking over a large sector of Gold Beach, 716 would have been, in fact, the forces defending all 3 beaches attacked by the Anglo-Canadian forces. So what we then have is a situation where if we walk the beach, we first of all start in front of the Juno Beach Center at the beach that is known as Mike. And what we would find there is the beginnings of what is called, I hope it will show up on your map clearly enough, Strong Point Coursoul, the 7th Brigade landings. So you can see on the right-hand side of the picture, the Canadian Scottish coming ashore. Canadian Scottish have a relatively little difficulty, a bit of machine gun fire, and later in the morning, about 9 o'clock, the balance of the Canadian Scottish, the other 3 companies and headquarters, will come ashore, and they are ordered to stay out of the battle for Strong Point Courseulles-sur-Mer if they possibly can. In fact, one company of the Canadian Scottish goes over to help out the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, but they're to stay out of the battle because their job is to get all the way inland to the Caen-Bayeux Highway, and they have to stay organized. So they're sitting over in the fields that you can see on the west side of Courseulles-sur-Mer, and indeed some of them, having been in Britain since 1941, are brewing tea, waiting for orders to move forward. A very different situation as you move east towards the 2 companies of the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, the Little Black Devils. And again, this will come up time and time again, but I've always loved this Royal Winnipeg Rifles war diary description of what happened on the morning of the 6th of June. It reads, 0749 hours. In spite of air bombardment failing, Royal Navy fire spotty, rockets falling short, AVRs and tanks late, Royal Winnipeg Rifles landed in 7 minutes. The bombardment having failed to kill a single German soldier or silence 1 weapon, these companies had to storm their positions cold and did so without hesitation. Now, you may be tempted to think that's bravado, but in fact, it is a realistic description of what happened on the morning of June the 6th. The company on the right that you can see so clearly marked there, which is B Company, had a relatively easier time because the German defenses, as you can see on the map, are concentrated to their left. But A Company came directly in front of the strong points, the resistance nests that make up part of the strong point in front of the Juno Beach Center. and they fought one of the most desperate and costly battles that would take place that morning. I've often compared D-Day for the infantry battalions to a lottery. It depends which task your company gets as to whether you'll confront horrendous deadly fire of the kind that many of you would seen in Saving Private Ryan, or whether you get a relatively clean run with minor casualties across the beach. So the battle at Courseulles-sur-Mer takes most of the morning as the right-hand side of the River Soule is cleared by the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, and what is called the island, where the river bends around, is cleared. They also run into some difficulties at Saint-Croix-sur-Mer, but fundamentally, each hour, the moment of landing is just before 8 a.m. in the morning, and by 10:45, the beach area, except for snipers, is under control, and the movement forward inland can begin. An enormous, stunning level of achievement in on the light green beaches. Now we're going to cross the River Soule, leave the Juno Beach Center, and go to the beach attacked by the Regina Rifles, not yet the Royal Regina Rifles, but the Regina Rifles, a regiment which, of course, I, together with one of their commanding officers and a D-Day veteran, Gordon Brown, wrote a book about. The landing of the Regina Rifles, again, if we go back to the 7th Brigade map, we can make it clear that the 7th Brigade map shows that the company on the right-hand side, A Company, is tasked with the job of going straight for the strong point. And the reason for that is the strong point includes an 88mm gun and a 75mm gun, both of which are capable of firing out to sea, and therefore impacting the reserve companies that would be coming in behind the assault companies. So again, A Company will find itself caught up in a battle of incredible ferocity. And every time they think they've cleared the early parts of the town, the close to the sea parts of the town, snipers will pop up, or indeed other kinds of fire will pop up, and they'll have to start doing it again. If you move to the left, Baker Company, B Company, lands well to the left of the strong point, which is concentrating its fire on the A Company, and it has a relatively easy time getting off the beach. It finds itself required immediately to lend support to A Company in clearing the rest of Courseulles-sur-Mer, and more than one platoon of A Company gets involved in that battle. Now, here's the lottery again, the difference between A and B Company. On the reserve companies for the Regina Rifles, Charlie Company came ashore relatively unscathed, further to the left or further to the east from the arrows we have described here, got off the beach in good order, and moved immediately to the inland highway. Those of you who've been there, near the Canadian Cemetery at Revier, and that their job was to get that bridge and control the only east-west road that linked the beaches. And under Major Stuart Tubb, they did that with enormous effectiveness. D Company, the other reserve company of the Reginas, ran into mine posts as the tide came in, as the morning progressed. And so badly were their landing craft hurt and hit by mines that only 49 men made it to shore. That doesn't mean all the rest were killed, but only 49 men made it to shore in sufficient order to participate in the advance inland. Though in many cases, they lacked much of their equipment, which they had to discard in order to make it to shore. So D Company has far and away the most difficult time when one is talking about the question of what is happening to reserves on D-Day. So what we have to say is that all aspects of the preparations for dealing with the Atlantic Wall coastal defenses had failed, and it was up to the infantry and the armor to actually overcome it. Now, it so happens that at the Royal Winnipeg breach, the armor was late, as the War Diary said, and wasn't involved in the initial thrust. The Regina Beach, 14 tanks made it ashore, perhaps slightly ahead of the infantry, and participated with Baker Company and to some extent with Charlie Company in the whole process of moving inland quickly. And it shows the difference it made when everything went well and the tanks were able to get into the beach and offer immediate support. Now, what we're going to do next is continue east. We're staying on the beach. We're letting the vans, or Jeff is driving one of the vans and he's taking it to the next beach at Bernières-sur-Mer. The rest of us are walking the beach from Courseulles-sur-Mer to Bernières-sur-Mer, and going to have a look at Man White, the beach attacked by the Queen's Own Rifles on the right, and as we'll see at Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, the North Shore Regiment on the left. These are the two assault battalions. On the way, we'll pass, since it's the current period, the Maison Canadien, and which was also the Maison Queen's Own Rifles for a while. And you'll see a picture of that in a moment, but there it is up on the screen. It is thought to be the first house liberated by ground troops on D-Day, and the Hoffer family, who own the right-hand side of the house, have allowed this to become a place where everyone can visit on D-Day and are treated with really remarkable hospitality. You can also see the flags flying. You can see the beach huts to the left, and to the right, you can see one of those endless condominiums that have been built by builders to provide summer vacation residences for the people from Caen and elsewhere in Normandy. But if we go back to the map of the 8th Brigade landings, we can again see as an illustration what it is that was involved in this problem of overcoming the beach defenses. Bernières-sur-Mer has a resistance nest, which is much less formidable than a strong point, such as existed at Courcelles. It has no guns that can fire directly out to sea, and therefore the Queen's Own Rifles were told, or were ordered, and were expected to land well to the west, that is to the left of the resistance nest, which you can see there so clearly. Their idea being to cross the beach, get over the beach wall, and outflank the defenders. The weather was such that the troops were pushed continuously to the east, and in particularly the case for B Company, which landed directly in front of the resistance nest. It faced the most horrendous fire and the heaviest casualties of any company landing in the Canadian sector on D-Day. The other company, which is A Company, did land much closer to the resistance nest than it wanted to, but it was still far enough away, or to put it another way, the gunners and mortars were so occupied with B Company that they let A Company escape a little bit. It made it across the beach in relatively quick time, made it to the seawall, crossed it, got onto the road and railroad that runs along the beach, and began attacking the resistance nest from the flank. So much so that much before Courseulles-sur-Mer, the beach defenses of Bernières-sur-Mer were under control by the Queen's Own Rifles, and the Regiment de la Chaudiere, the reserve battalion of the brigade, was able to begin landing and it was going to, of course, like the Canadian Scottish, begin the advance inland. The problem in Bernières-sur-Mer then was not so much the overcoming of the resistance nest, tell that to the men of A Company who landed there and were killed in the sand. But in the overall picture, the problem was that the circumstances of the problems in front of Saint-Aubin and Bernières-sur-Mer that had made the Germans believe these were not likely places for the Allies to attack. That is a series of reefs called the Roches de Bernières, which were just off the coast, created a situation where we are able, under some circumstances, to land the troops, the reserve troops, particularly the 9th Brigade, which is the brigade in reserve, at both Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer and Bernières-sur-Mer. But Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer was declared closed by the Navy, and therefore everyone had to go into Bernières-sur-Mer. Now, all of the vehicles, not only the duplex drive tanks, but the trucks and other vehicles had all been waterproofed with gunk all over them. To keep this simple, And as they landed, as they began to move through Bernier, if you come there with me, you'll see the narrow street leading away from the beach. You'll see the steeple of the church. You'll see the problem of making turns with vehicles. And all of this became one monstrous traffic jam as the caulking or the waterproofing, which was in danger of overheating engines, took place. And when the 9th Brigade began to land about 11:30 in the morning, all that they could see in front of them was traffic piled up trying to get out through the beach exits. Ross Munro, the only D-Day correspondent authorized by Canadian press to land with the Canadian troops, came in with the Reserve Brigade. He said he took one look at the mess and got out of the way because he was sure the Germans were going to use their artillery to attack it. They didn't, because the coastal batteries that would have been capable of firing on such a mass of men had been successfully engaged by the Royal Navy. Quickly, moving to Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, or the outskirts of Bernier-sur-Mer, over to Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer, the North Shore New Brunswick Regiment is successful in landing to the flank of the resistance nest, which dominates the approaches to Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer. Again, we're in a situation where Baker Company on the left comes under much heavier fire than does A Company slightly to the right. These are the North Shore Regiment landing at the area just immediately to the west of Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer. And the North Shore Regiment will fight a long morning's battle to clear the resistance nest in Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer and the town, and also to get inland. Their 2 reserve companies, which land successfully, are again ordered not to become engaged in the battle for Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer. They are to move inland towards Tailleville as quickly as they can, leaving the 2 assault companies to take care of the beaches, together with 48 Royal Marine Commando. The story of 48 Royal Marine Commando is unfortunately too complex for any attempt by me to detail it tonight, but in simple terms, 48 Royal Marine Commando was to land behind the North Shores and take over the clearance of the rest of Saint-Aubin and move east to match up or connect the beaches of Juno and Sword with another Royal Marine Commando coming at it from the other direction, from the Sword direction to the east. Unfortunately, by the time the Royal Marine Commando were fitted out, the only landing craft available to them were plywood landing craft. And when they came in to unload and participate in their share of the operation, the 50-millimeter gun that still exists en situ in place in Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer had a field day targeting the plywood boats. They got caught up on the mines, and the Royal Marine Commandos suffered very, very heavily in a way that slowed down the role that they could play, both in the clearance of Saint-Aubin and in reaching beyond Langrune-sur-Mer to Lyon-sur-Mer, which was supposed to be their objective. So again, the 8th Brigade landings at Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer went ahead without the problems of landing too close to the resistance nests, but the weather had prevented any effective suppression, never mind destruction of the beach defenses. So what we've done so far is to have a look at what actually happened on the day in relationship to the overall problems that were encountered. I might say, I'll have the people in Winnipeg mad at me, that the tanks of the Fort Garry Horse played a very significant role, particularly with the North Shores at Saint-Aubin-sur-Mer. And their story, which is told so well in the Regimental History Vanguard, is well worth knowing more about than we have time for this morning. Well, what we can say, to summarize then, is the advance inland began at varying times, roughly 10:45, over on parts of the Courcelles-sur-Mer beach to 12 on the Bernier-sur-Mer beaches. And the problem that they encountered on the advance inland was congestion, snipers, minor resistance, except at Tyville, where the headquarters of a battalion and associated troops confronted the New Brunswick Regiment, the North Shore Regiment, and there was a significant battle at Tyville. But for the Royal Winnipeg Rifles, the Canadian Scottish and the Regina Rifles, there are some terrible incidents on the advance inland on D-Day, but there is not sufficient German organized resistance to prevent us from reaching the midway point, the intermediate objective, Elm, it's codenamed, by the late afternoon, early evening, depending where along the front we are concerning ourselves with. One last point, and then we can leave this for the moment, and maybe I'll fill in some more when we come to questions. So the last point that I would make about all of this is simply to say that the infantry and armor and engineers and all the other associated ancillary troops who were engaged in the combat on D-Day achieved extraordinary things: courage, valor, leadership, ability to survive the chaos of battle, where after you cross the start line, all plans fall apart, and improvise. And the measure of that is the degree of success the Canadians had under circumstances where, yes, the casualties are serious, almost 1,000 killed, wounded, and missing in the assault on Juno Beach. But compared to the scenes we know from Omaha, or indeed some other parts of the beaches, much of what happened on Juno is a tribute to the effectiveness of the Canadian soldier, armored, and infantry. Jeff.
Wow, Terry, you can have a quick drink of water. I think you covered.
Okay, I will.
Yeah, superbly. You really.
I put the wine away, Jeff. I thought the wine wasn't a good thing to have in front of the camera.
We'll edit that remark out later. So when we talk, and your last point was really powerful, and yet when we come to discussions of the Canadian performance, you put me to mind of a commentary that the Globe and Mail published many years ago, just after Spielberg's Saving Private Ryan came out. And his point was that, if we'd made Saving Private Ryan, that is, if Canadians had made it, we would have never gotten off the beach. I'm paraphrasing from Steve Weatherby's column here. Private Ryan would have been flattened by a German Tiger with the rescue squad dead to the last man in the circle around him. So how did such a negative view, one that's so very different from what you've just presented, how did such a negative view develop? Well,
yeah, this is really quite interesting, and I'm going to do this carefully because I don't want to slash at anyone, and I don't want to be too clever about it all. Let me say this. Part of the problem specifically related to D-Day is that when the Canadians landed on June the 6th, two factors were evident. The first is that the British were absolutely determined that censorship would prevent any knowledge of who the troops undertaking the landing were. Mackenzie King was informed, for example, in the morning, or Prime Minister, not even told when the date of D-Day was, when he was woken up at 4 o'clock in the morning. All that he could learn is what we as Canadians learned in 1944, that the Anglo-Canadian American armies had landed on the coast of Normandy and Canadians were included. And King was able to learn that both the CAF and the RAF were also involved. Ross Munro, as I said, the only correspondent who was able to land, was a very interesting man. I interviewed Ross at length many years ago now when I was working on Maple Leaf Route Caen, and I asked him a number of questions about D-Day, including why in Gauntlet to Overlord, the book that he had written about the Canadians in Normandy, as well as other parts of the war, he wrote, and I'm quoting now, "It was the fight for the beachhead perimeter and the advance to Caen that required immense endurance, stamina, and courage." He seemed to think that because the beach landings were relatively quick and certainly successful, that they weren't as important a part of the story as the one that Mark Milner will be telling about the defense of the bridgehead, or Operation Charnwood, the battle for Caen, or Goodwood, or the road to Falaise. And yet, in a sense, that's a very typically Canadian situation, because the reality is the success of establishing the beachhead and then expanding the bridgehead on June the 6th and June the 7th is all part of the basic story before 21 Panzer Division, 12th SS Panzer Division, Panzerlehr, and other German reinforcements arrive. So I'm not sure why Canadians are so hesitant to celebrate success, but let me just mention CP Stacey. Now, I wasn't a student of Stacey's, but I certainly met him a number of times in the 80s when I was working on the Maple Leaf Route series with my friend and mentor, Robert Vogel. And let me just remind you, he published a historical summary of the entire campaign in 1948, which sold 15,000 copies, a bestseller in Canadian terms today, never mind in 1948. And it's just interesting, Dieppe got 38 pages of Stacey's book, and D-Day got 3. Now, again, I guess Stacey knew what to do with Dieppe and didn't know what to do with D-Day. Then in 1952, published 6 Years of War, the overview of everything except the campaign in Northwest Europe, and that got, it's almost hard to believe, that 98 pages were devoted to Hong Kong and almost the same number to Dieppe. Now, in fairness, there wasn't anything about D-Day on it because it wasn't the purpose of the book, but the weighting of what to investigate, what questions to ask, what to say about the past is really interesting. So when the Victory Campaign, his history of the entire campaign, came out in 1960, presumably veterans of D-Day were expecting more, but there are only 10 pages devoted to the Canadian experience of D-Day, again, in comparison to far more extensive treatment of other issues. Not only that, but I've been rereading Stacey again, so I'm not going to be too simplistic about it. If you read his chapters on the preparation for D-Day or for Overlord Neptune, the invasion, you find there's really quite a lot of information there that would allow people to come to various conclusions. He knows, for example, that the operational research reports show that the suppressive fire didn't work, that more damage was done, that the bombs were dropped too far inland. He knows all the things I've been telling about you, but he mixes them in with a general, I'm almost tempted to say, PR view of the effectiveness of air and artillery. And most of all, as I've said in Fields of Fire and elsewhere, the disturbing thing about Stacey's account is in the end, when he's summarizing everything, and he says, and this is our official history, which all the British and American and other people rely on, he says, when all is said and done, we could, I'm quoting, we could have accomplished more on D-Day. Perhaps we were too easily satisfied. And then he says, we were better at set piece and not at exploitation. And then, quote, we might be able to learn something from the Germans. This thread of relative failure on the part of Canadians and of the military supremacy of the Germans is repeated time after time in the summaries of actions. And although in a sense Stacey's account is balanced, there's evidence available that which you can use to think that through. Readers as recently as Max Hastings' History of the Battle of Normandy or Carl D'Este's have all relied on Stacey's rather jaundiced view of the effectiveness of the ordinary Canadian soldier in the ordinary Canadian battalion. So I wanted to say that first because I think that all of this is deep-rooted in Canadian official history of the Second World War, long before popularizers get hold of the topic and do with what they will. Now, this is a personal anecdote and it's self-promotion, except Nobody can find any copies of Maple Leaf Loot Caen anymore, so I can't sell them to you because I don't have any. In fact, for purposes of this talk, I had to loan my copy, single copy, to Matt Baker to put together the slides. When Bob Vogel and I decided in 1981 that we were going to do some military history, he was a diplomatic historian, I was a social historian. We both had sabbaticals coming up. We wanted to do something different. And we decided to undertake a study of the operations in the Scheldt estuary, with Bob using the German sources, since he was fluent in German, and I using the Canadian sources. We quickly discovered, or especially I did, because I traveled to Europe with my wife in a borrowed MGA, which leaked and had terrible brakes, to explore the Scheldt battlefields. During the course of that operation, as I've often told students, I developed a research agenda, but the research agenda quickly required me, and I told Bob this and he quickly agreed, we had to go back to Normandy. We couldn't start in the Scheldt. We had to see what had happened before October of 1944. So Linda, my wife, and I made the trip to Normandy on that same voyage in which we went and looked at the Scheldt. I remember arriving, we made it as far south as Lyon-sur-Mer because the rain was so heavy that the roof of the MG was leaking like a sieve. And we stayed our first night in Normandy in Lyon-sur-Mer and had one of those lovely meals that you get in Normandy, no menu, they just offered you fish with calvados and lots of cream, and it was delicious. The next day, we explored the Normandy beaches and found virtually nothing except the very original monuments that had been arranged by the regiments. For example, the North Shore Regiment had constructed a visible memorial that's still there, and there was a few around Bernières and a few around Courseulles-sur-Mer, but no presence of the Canadian government, nothing. In short, you couldn't learn anything about it from actually being there unless you had maps and air photographs and a copy of Stacey with you. So that was the first of what might be for Linda and I, maybe 20 visits that we made to the Normandy coast, leading battlefield tours. And it certainly inspired in us a belief that something should be done. Last word on Maple Leaf Route Caen, nobody would publish it. That's not quite true. McClellan and Stewart agreed to publish it so long as we combined the first two volumes, Caen and Falaise, and did away with the photographs and the documents. Well, that was no good to me. It wasn't at all what I was trying to do. So, as I've said, we published the Maple Leaf series ourselves, and my children, as child labor, shipped it from our farmhouse in Wellington County. Eventually, Caen sold 5,000 copies, so somebody liked it. If anybody has a copy they don't want, they could send it to me. I'd be grateful. And Falaise and Antwerp and Scheldt and Victory all did very well subsequently. But the impact was on a very narrow group of veterans and families of veterans that were interested in the Second World War and were interested in the photographs and the war diary extracts and stuff like that. I think that in 1984, for example, on the 40th anniversary of D-Day, Canadians were not paying attention in any realistic way until, I'm going to take a moment and read you a brief paragraph. Ronald Reagan, not my most admired US president, Ronald Reagan gave a speech at Pont de Hoc, the place attacked by the American Rangers. The speech was written by a young journalist, Peggy Noonan, who'd got a job in Reagan's office about 3 months before, and somebody tasked her with the question of doing a draft. And Peggy describes in her memoir the inspiration that came from a variety of sources. But Reagan's speech, which is many regard as crucial to his re-election and to some people say it's one of the greatest speeches ever made by an American president, had an important Canadian note, and it was shown on Canadian television on the morning of June 6, 1984. Reagan said, and I'm quoting, "The unsurpassed courage of the Canadians, who had already seen the horrors of war on this coast. They know what awaited them, but they could not be deterred. Once they hit Juno Beach, they never looked back." Now, no Canadian leader had ever said anything remotely like that, and Pierre Trudeau, who was in the audience, could not, of course, have attempted to say anything of that sort, given his own role during the Second World War, and indeed his own position in 1984 when he was on the verge of retirement. So apart from Reagan, 1984 passed with no particular attention paid to the Canadians, period, and no particular attention certainly to D-Day. Now, we're next dealing, of course, with the question of how we move forward. And it's interesting to see, and here I'm getting a bit in the way of Jeff, that in the early 1990s, Le Memorial in Caen had contacted an organization or dealt with an organization called the American Battle of Normandy Foundation, which in those days was extremely well funded, and it began construction of a memorial garden at Caen's Le Memorial, a memorial to the war museum. And the people from Le Memorial came to Ottawa to try and raise interest in Canada. They found no interest at DND, no interest at the Canadian War Museum, indeed no interest anywhere. But a Canadian veteran of the Second World War, who Jeff mentioned, Hamilton Southam, who'd been an artillery officer, decided to take this up as a personal cause. And he began to consult with other veterans, including Willie Reed, who was a Caen loan officer who served with a British battalion in the Normandy campaign, and then became a major general in the Canadian forces, and a group of other veterans in the Ottawa area. And they came to the conclusion that the best possible way of going about dealing with some way of competing, if you will, with the American Memorial Garden, which was under construction in Normandy, was to create a parallel Canadian Memorial Garden. And they decided to let students who were the age of the soldiers who'd landed in 1944 undertake the planning of the garden. Now, Dan Griffiths, who was the architecture professor, landscape architecture professor from Carleton University, and her colleague on the project, Bernard Lafleur from the University of Montreal, supervised student teams from those two universities. And the idea was to take them to Normandy after meeting the Canadian veterans in Ottawa, take them to Normandy, let them look at the space and decide what they wanted to do with it. And there were a number of teams, and the team that won the competition is the team that planned the garden, part of which you see before us. I want to just read what Nan Griffith, a particular treasure to me because she is the mother of my daughter-in-law, all of which is total coincidence. I didn't know that till I met Nan at a Canadian Battle of Normandy Foundation meeting. But she and her colleagues supervised the students, and she wrote, and I'm quoting, "On arrival in Normandy, it became apparent that there was no agreement on what the project should be, where it should be located, or what funding might be available. A model of the American garden designed by professional architects with a budget of millions offered little guidance, and the students began to work as individuals, developing ideas before forming 3 teams for competition. The site was selected partly for its remoteness from the American garden, and partly because it lent itself to the symbolic, metaphorical approach the students preferred." And Griffiths continued, "The idea is remembrance is implied rather than literal. The space of the valley evokes a sense of the fearsomeness of the space of the landing, of time and waiting, of exposure in a large site and a large situation. A theater of war is transformed into a theater of memory." Paul Gough, a professor at the University of Bristol in Britain, visited the garden, which he regards as a singular achievement, equaled by the memorial in Green Park that was unveiled in the same era, and also Vimy and Beaumont-Hamel. He regards it as something you should read, as he calls it, from the area of black granite where water flows when we're there as the battlefield tour visiting. because the grids, Paul suggests, represent the Atlantic crossing and indeed the crossing of the English Channel, like a naval chart. And then the landing occurs, and then the empty space you can see you have to cross before you reach the heights, which must be climbed, which are both metaphorical and, in the sense of Falaise, realistic kind of imagery that brings forward. Now, I love the garden, and I really think taking students there and letting them think through an interpretation of it is very, very important. And the Normandy, now the Canadian Battlefields Foundation, does that every year. And very often there'll be quite moving ceremonies there, depending on the circumstances. But the reality is that that's the memorial looking up at the garden. The garden is over to the left-hand side of the picture. The reality, I would have to say, is that the garden, however much it influenced landscape architects and however much it impressed me, had practically no effect upon the general public. Maybe the best way of expressing this is to talk about Garth Webb and the Juno Beach Center. Garth and I became good friends in the early stages of the Juno Beach Center. Garth and Lise Cooper, his partner, came to visit me at my office in Laurier and told me about their vision for a bricks and mortar museum on the Calvados coast to celebrate what the Canadians achieved. And I asked Garth about the memorial and the garden that had by then been opened and was available for viewing. And Garth and Lise didn't like it at all. They thought it didn't tell the story in any meaningful way and would require interpreters on site to give it any weight. I asked them about the Bayeux Museum, which I thought very highly of, or the one at Aramanche-les-Bains, the Musée des Débarquements, and they still thought it had to be uniquely Canadian. So for a couple of years, I worked with Garth and Lise. At that stage, we were going to try and acquire property in Bernier-sur-Mer. In particular, the railway station was to be the core of which is a genuine leftover from 1944 site, which is now the Tourist Bureau in Bernier-sur-Mer. We were going to acquire the railway station and the cafe next door and improvise a museum on the basis of that. Well, nobody was very interested. To put it mildly, the Canadian government wasn't interested, and I have to say I lost interest too. Garth, as many of you who knew him will know, is a kind of take no prisoners advocate for what it is that he wants to accomplish. The strength of his vision is fascinating. On the road to the completion of the vision, Garth was a difficult person to deal with. So Garth went on, and as you know, the attention shifted from Bernier-sur-Mer to Courseulles-sur-Mer, and he was able to acquire the support of the community and of the département for a museum which would be located right on the beach where the Royal Winnipeg Rifles landed. And Garth was able, I think it's not unfair to say, to capitalize on a distinct change in Canadian attitudes towards D-Day and what followed subsequently. And I have to say, I attribute a lot of it to Saving Private Ryan. Saving Private Ryan was a runaway success in Canada, as well as the United States. And it's true, it barely mentioned Canadians, just as The Longest Day had only mentioned Canadians in passing. But the proof of this is that shortly after Saving Private Ryan came out, the Canadian press conducted a poll about important events in Canadian history. Canadians picked D-Day as the #1 event, even though they couldn't have known very much about it because there were no sources that would tell them about it. Because, of course, the Valor and the Horror, which had included 3 very negative, error-filled episodes on Canadian experience in the Second World War, concentrated on Hong Kong, Verrières Ridge and Bomber Command, only a very brief passing derogatory mention of the Canadians on D-Day. And as you know, I was involved in the answer to The Valor and the Horror, which was a film that Barney Danson, the former Minister of National Defense, made, caused to be made, called No Price Too High, but it was typical of the late 1990s in Canada that neither the CBC nor CTV would put No Price Too High on the air. Most Canadians finally got to see No Price Too High when a PBS station close to the Canadian border decided to broadcast it as part of either Remembrance Day or, to be frank, fundraising, trying to draw a Canadian audience in. And so that the impact of the full episode that we did on D-Day in No Price Too High seems to have been minimal compared to the impact of what Steven Spielberg was able to achieve in terms of making D-Day important. So moving forward and then trying to leave lots of time for questions. Garth Webb and Lee Cooper and the committee, which is perpetuated today of very eager, anxious, and hardworking people, began to create the Juno Beach Center, which was scheduled to open in 2003 in time for the 60th anniversary in 2004. Now, that anniversary was an extraordinary experience. I was there with a group of students as part of the Laurier battlefield study tours, which my friends John and Patty Clegorn had organized or helped to pay for. And we took about 16 Laurier students who were taking a course over in 2004. And Queen Elizabeth was to come to the Juno Beach Center, and there was to be a fly pass of a Spitfire and a Lancaster bomber, and there were speeches and large crowds. 6,000 people came, and Canada Remembers brought students over, and it was covered by television. It was, in a sense, an extravaganza about Canada's D-Day. And I think that from then on, battlefield study tours by groups like the Canadian Battlefields Foundation, but like Laurier, teacher tours like the ones run by the Gregg Centre, and public tours. Jeff and I have done a number of public tours in which we just invited people who are interested to come along with us on the understanding that it was going to be a serious study tour, not simply a quick drift over the events. So from 2004 on, the 60th anniversary, there has been an enormous interest in D-Day, which has not faded, and which from my point of view is something that we all should be proud of. And at the same time, of course, we should be deeply and profoundly proud of the achievement of the Canadian soldier in the fields of fire of Normandy. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Terry. Your presentation was, as we all expected, powerful and informative, and I've heard versions of it once or twice over the years, and every time I learned something new. So I think that was the same, I'm sure, for everyone else. Now, again, I'm going to ask you to organize here. There have been some good questions that people have been asking, so I'll try to channel a few, if you don't mind. And Eric, our mastermind behind the behind our Zoom meeting, doesn't mind. We may well go a little.
Jeff, I think you turned your microphone off by accident.
Oh, sorry, I was trying to do that. So my question, and I'll just say by forewarning, we've got an awful lot of people watching tonight, and that's terrific. And a lot of people have asked questions, but we simply don't have time to answer all of your questions. I've been trying to deal with a few of them as we go, but my apologies in advance if we can't get to your question. I will, though, get you, Terry, if you could. And this was a neat question that I've now lost in the list. But the role of the Regiment de la Chaudiere is one that is worth mentioning. And I wonder if you could just spend a moment talking about the fact that I'm always struck, and I didn't know this until I think you maybe told me this, or maybe a Juno Beach guide told me this, that the suite from west to east also matched the geographic location of so many of the units, the Scots from Victoria, BC, and then the Wpgs and the Reginas, and all the way down. So central Canada was at Bernier with the Queen's Own and the Regiment de Chaudiere. Can you speak a little bit to the fact that this unit of people whose ancestors came from Normandy were storming the beaches in 1944?
Well, the Regiment de Chaudiere is, of course, in reserve behind 8th Brigade. And since I'm limiting myself to what actually happened on June the 6th, the Chaudieres come ashore when this monstrous traffic jam is developing in the streets of Bernier-sur-Mer, and they have to wait their turn before they can move forward. I don't want to, again, make this too complicated, but the Queen's Own Rifles and the tanks of the Fort Garry's were trying to get out into the open country beyond Bernier, but there was a German 88mm gun, which was fending them off, if you will, and one of the rounds from that gun exploded an ammunition sledge that was being towed by one of the self-propelled artillery pieces, and setting off spontaneous explosions on the edge of Bernier-sur-Mer, which further made things difficult. So until the Queen's Own could actually deal with that gun position, which they did, the Chaudes couldn't move forward. Now the Chaudes will liberate Benny-sur-Mer, near where the cemetery is, and will advance during the course of June the 6th inland. But they're not a central part of the story of D-Day. They're part of the story of the capture of Raux, the little village that was held by the 12th SS. And they are part of the story of Carpiquet and many other places. But on D-Day, I suppose the story that people remember is because they spoke French, they were greeted fondly by the local population, some of which had not been evacuated. And there is, of course, a story of a cafe that had opened by about 10 o'clock in the morning, which was offering wine and beer to soldiers who were waiting to be given the chance to move forward. And presumably some of them were Chaudieres and some were the rear parts of the Queen's Own Rifles.
Good. I was really glad that you mentioned about the Hoffer family, who in fact are members of the Canadian Battlefields Foundation and continue, especially with the Queen's Own.
I've met the Hoffer family many times by going there, with particularly when I've gone with True Patriot Love. In recent years, as you know, my battlefield tours have been run largely with True Patriot Love for about the last 10 years.
I wonder if you would, though, in just talking about the reception of the Canadians that come ashore, you mentioned about preliminary bombardments and the enormous efforts to try to divert attention away towards the Pas-de-Calais, and those implications had enormous consequences for French civilians. Can you just speak to that?
I will. That's a really important question. First of all, the bombardment in Courseulles, Bernier, and Saint-Aubin destroyed a lot of houses, as did the armor in searching out for snipers in the clearance of the houses. I think about 40% of the houses closest to the sea in Bernier, Courseulles, and Saint-Aubin were destroyed and had to be rebuilt after the war. Now that's minor stuff compared to what you really want me to talk about, which is the decision to use the heavy bombers and the medium bombers to try and interdict Normandy, that is, to prevent reinforcements from reaching Normandy. Eisenhower and Churchill were extremely nervous about this, and in the end only agreed to allow it to happen immediately before D-Day, because what Bomber Command wanted to do was tackle bridges which were of necessity located in the center of towns and villages in Normandy. And we know that Bomber Command was not capable, any more than the United States Army Air Force was, of precision bombing. And that so if you are going to bomb Lisieux, where an important bridge crossed the river, or you are going to bomb at other key points in which German reinforcements would arrive, we were going to kill a lot of French people, and we did. The losses are extremely significant, as of course they are in Caen, not only during the bombing of Caen on July the 8th, but in earlier raids upon Caen as a city. Eisenhower decided, I think correctly, that preventing large numbers of German reinforcements from reaching the Normandy bridgehead in the early stages of the battle was crucial. De Gaulle knew about it and accepted the reality of the necessity of bombing. I don't think the bombing was particularly successful, and that is hindsight, in the sense that the people who organized the bombing couldn't have known that, relatively speaking, those German reinforcements that tried to reach the beachhead in the 48 hours after the landings did so. And were not, in fact, interdicted by bombing or by the tactical air force.
How long, and again, this perhaps ties to the point you're making. This is a question by Stephen Fisher. How many days did it take after the 6th of June before the Germans realized that it was Normandy that was the primary landing site?
But it really is late July, early August before they're willing to commit armored reserves from north of the Seine to Normandy. Even then, there are those who think there still is, this Normandy is a feint attack, and there still will be. But they're stuck with the problem that if they don't send reinforcements to Normandy, infantry and especially armor, the German defenses are going to crack at almost any time. And once, as you know, the German defenses did crack on July 26, 27, 28 during the American breakout in Operation Cobra. It's almost too late. The Germans continue to begin transferring troops to Normandy, but they don't really get them there in time to make a significant difference. By then, the Allied buildup makes the odds of a successful German defense of the rest of Normandy pretty impossible.
A question by John Plumpton, who is perhaps taking gentle issue with your take on Montgomery. If Montgomery knew so little about the invasion, why was he chosen to present the invasion plan to Churchill and the King at St. Paul's School prior to the invasion?
Well, I'd be careful about this. Montgomery was a highly experienced soldier. He took the view that as the commander of all of the land forces, he should be distant from the details. He took the view that his job was to exude optimism, to encourage people, to never let a pessimistic note enter into anything that he said. And he spent the weeks, indeed months before D-Day, visiting British troops, Canadian troops, American troops up and down the coast. I mentioned this in the context of Eisenhower, who it's clear was much more hands-on, concerned with the detail. That isn't praise for Eisenhower and criticism of Montgomery. It's noting a very different vision of what a commander at a certain level could do. But I don't want to escape this completely. Montgomery seems to have discarded or refused to regard information that didn't suit his optimism. The most crucial question is, of course, the question of the weakness of Allied armor. One doesn't have time to go into this in any detail, but a Sherman tank was quite appropriately called by an American author who served in the American Armored Division a death trap. We know from operational research reports that armored divisions equipped with Shermans or Cromwells, that the tanks were destroyed by a single round from a German anti-tank gun, 75 or 88, didn't matter. And their effectiveness was so sharply limited that they couldn't play the role that German armor played for German troops, which was to help lead them in an attack. The tanks had to be very careful. Indeed, as Radley Walters used to say, what every tanker needs is smoke. And I remember asking him, as many other people did, what do you use the smoke for? Doesn't matter, smoke. You've got to obscure the enemy, you've got to obscure yourself, because if you're targeted, you're dead, that you'll be destroyed. In the criticism that was developed about Allied armor, I mean, Montgomery is simply not involved. You can't criticize him for it. That isn't the level of detail that he's willing to pay any particular attention to. That's up to the Armored Corps to solve. So I've always had mixed feelings about Montgomery, because I think many of his decisions in his set piece attacks are based upon a misunderstanding of what it is exactly the armor and artillery and infantry can accomplish.
Sure, sure. I'm glad that you mentioned about the 31st Canadian minesweeping flotilla that paved the way, if that's the right expression, for the for the landings into Omaha, and there is a poster, a plaque that we have, I hope, installed as on behalf of Canadian Battlefields Foundation. On the other side of the bridgehead are the Canadian paras. And you mentioned about the Para Museum, which includes the Canadians in that. I wonder if you could speak briefly to the role of the paras, both Canadian and British, on the east side of the bridgehead.
Well, throughout the pre-planning of Neptune Overlord, it was quite clear that on the eastern flank, the 6th British Airborne Division would have to land in a way that would effectively seal off the bridgehead. The fear was, of course, of the Germans rolling it up from either flank, and that's why so much attention was paid to linking the beaches so there would be no flank to roll up. But on the eastern side, life was made somewhat simpler by the German decision to flood the Dives Valley and create a kind of water barrier on the left flank. So what there then was is the high ground between the Dives River Valley and the Orne. And the whole idea was for 6th British Airborne, including 1st Canadian Parachute Battalion, to seize that high ground and hold it at whatever cost. And they were also, of course, to take out the Merville Battery and clean up some other things. But as those of you who've been to the Le Mesnil Crossroads, where the Canadian Memorial is located, the Canadians had a particularly difficult task because they're kind of in the center of this ridge line that has to be held. And the only way paratroopers could hold it, they don't have their own artillery, they didn't have much in the way of air support, is by being aggressive. So they had to dominate the no man's land between the 346th German Division, which had crossed the Seine from 15th Army, unobstructed by air power, to take up a position on the eastern edge of the ridge. And so it was then a contest of wills between the Para Division and elements of 51st Highland Division of the British Army as to who would control the eastern side of the bridgehead. And the British won. The British and Canadians won. I realize how long I've been on in my talk.
I've never heard you just come to such an abrupt ending.
Catch up a bit in terms of time.
Good. Well, we have time for a few more questions, and then we'll finish things off. Few really nice reflections by people whose families were part of the events that you're describing. One gentleman referring to a veteran he knew who had lost significant hearing on D-Day, which no doubt was a common affliction among so many of them, given the gunfire that we were subject to. Maybe I'll make a quick comment too, because you were talking about memory, and so much of what we're going to talk about in our series is about memory and how we've understood the evolving memory of the Canadians in Normandy. And Marie-Eve Vaillancourt from the Juno Beach Center will be talking about that in a few weeks. I was struck though that we're talking about Saving Private Ryan, but it reminded me very much of a conference that you and I both attended in Vancouver in 1995. And you recall how enormous the liberation celebrations were in the Netherlands. This obviously isn't about D-Day, but it was that 50th anniversary decade when so much was happening, but in advance of that film. And you're right in speaking of our own controversies about the Valor and the Horror and your film, No Price Too High, which answered it. But you recall that weekend, if you can, and that was the place, Arnhem and Grosbeek and so many Dutch villages and towns and cities just exploded for appreciation for the Canadians. And I think it took so many people by surprise. I think that too, I suppose, was one of the ways in which we began to rethink our understanding of the Canadians in the war.
Yes, I quite agree. And I also think Canadians who go to Normandy discover that the people in Normandy are, first of all, they're very nice and friendly, and it's a great place to visit. But they know the Canadians in our part of Normandy, as I would think of it, the Juno sector, are glad to see you. There's no standoffishness and no fear of being overrun by tourists. So when I go to Normandy, or same as to Holland, sometimes with you, sometimes not, we both experience this, I'm going to say, almost love or affection for the Canadians that in fact begins on D-Day and continues through to the end of the war.
Mark, I mispronounce your name. I'm sorry, Mark. Mark Kube, Mark Kube, is happy, and so many people are appreciative of your talks and your works. He's very honored that his father's name was mentioned in the book that you wrote with Gordon Brown on the Regina Rifles. He had an experience at the 60th D-Day commemorative events, meeting a Métis veteran who was, well, he wasn't from the Regina Rifles. He was part of the last surviving commando, and from his unit. So I'm not quite sure. Perhaps he was in Northwest Europe. I'm not sure. But the part of our discussion of memory is about the role of Aboriginal people in the armed forces. And I wonder if you could comment briefly on that.
Well, I'd like to comment by sticking to the Regina Rifles, admittedly
Sure.
my favorite battalion in the whole Canadian Army. D Company, which Gordon Brown, my co-author, commanded, was about 30% Indigenous, if we include Métis in the total picture of Indigenous. Certainly Gordon spoke most fondly of his sergeant, who was a Métis, and a number of stories are included in our book, Look to Your Front Regina Rifles, that relate to Métis and Indian soldiers. It's quite clear that Indigenous soldiers played a significant role out of proportion, we say this slowly, out of proportion to their share of the population in the Canadian Army. And a lot of them have been noted in various separated accounts. I guess the point that's difficult to get across in the current environment is that in the Canadian Army, a soldier was accepted for his ability to contribute to the platoon or company and not for his racial origin. And I mean that quite seriously. They could be, Canadian soldiers could be very censorious of someone who did not live up to what was needed because what your comrade did was one of the things that made you safe. So there is far less attention paid to whether the soldier is Aboriginal or not, Indigenous or not, but more likely whether he's someone whom you can count on in a battle. And certainly within the Reginas, there was never any question about that. Gordon thought that Dog Company was a highly effective force. He only took it over after the disaster on D. He took it over on D+1, but commanded it for a good part of the rest of the war, and it continued to have a significant number of Indigenous soldiers.
Excellent, excellent. I'm always struck too when you talk about Gordon Brown and the descriptions that you included in that book, which were really so affecting, how young these guys were. You know, battalion commanders are maybe, what, 25, 20, maybe 30. Company commanders like Gordon Brown were in their early 20s, and the others were kids.
As you know, Jeff, I'm working at the moment on a project that involves the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, who took the vanguard in on D-Day. The commander of the vanguard, who was a good friend of mine, Learmont, in his later years, was a major commanding not only his own company of the North Nova Scotia Highlanders, but the Camerons and the whole force that included the Sherbrooke Fusilier tanks and the M10s, and he was 24.
Right.
And his company and lieutenant commanders were under 24. The two most famous platoon commanders, we call the two Jacks from Will Bird's book, were 20 years old in 1944. They joined in 1943 at 19 and turned 20. It's really an interesting phenomena to think of how young they were.
Well, Terry, I'm going to wrap things up here. We've got a few other housekeeping things, but I just want to thank you again for, well, I got a lot to thank you for, but I think as always, your presentations are wonderful and inspiring, and I always learn something new, and I've heard, as I said, a few of them before. So in 2 weeks' time, we'll be hearing from Mark Milner, who will take us further inland to talk about the Canadian role there. We've got lots of issues that you've raised so wonderfully that we're going to, I hope, pick up on in the weeks and months to come as we slowly follow the Canadians through the Normandy campaign. But unfortunately, in these Zoom meetings, we can't fully express our appreciation. So thank you.
Thanks for having me, Jeff, and all of the gang. I want to thank you all for putting this together for an old guy who wasn't very comfortable with Zoom, but has managed it quite well, I think, I hope. I wish everyone the best. I have an appointment for my second shot of the Pfizer vaccine on June the 23rd. I'm so thrilled by that because it means hopefully I can get to go to my cottage at some point this summer, and Quebec will let me in again. So take care, everyone. Be safe, as they say. Good night.